My mother didn't even wait for dessert. She stood at the head of the dining table, looked down at my simple sweater and said loudly enough for all 12 guests to hear, "Christmas is meant for people who actually made something of their lives, not a government clerk who barely scrapes by." My sister laughed, my brother-in-law smirked, and before anyone took a bite of pie, my father set my small duffel bag on the snowy porch. They locked the door behind me, thinking they had finally purged the family embarrassment. But in their rush to humiliate me, they didn't realize I had left my heavy wool trench coat hanging by the entryway. Exactly 3 hours later, a black government convoy pulled up to their driveway, and a 4-star Admiral walked inside, pointed at my coat and asked the room one chilling question: "Where is my commander?" My name is Evelyn Vance. I am 32 years old, and for the last 8 years, my family believed I was nothing more than an entry-level logistics clerk shuffling papers in a drab government basement. The dining room table at my parents' suburban home in Highland Park was set with crystal stemware and silver platters, an opulent display designed entirely for my older sister, Chloe, and her husband, Brad. Brad was a regional director at an elite defense consulting firm, a man who never missed an opportunity to flash his Rolex or casually drop the names of corporate executives he claimed to advise. Throughout the evening, the air was thick with rehearsed bragging. Chloe flaunted her designer handbag, while Brad held court about his company's impending multi-million-dollar military contract. Every time I spoke, the room cooled. When I complimented the roast, my mother sighed about how difficult it must be for me to afford groceries on a public employee's stipend. When Brad spoke about national defense logistics, he looked directly at me with a condescending smirk, explaining basic supply chain terms as if I were a child. Because of my security clearance, I couldn't correct him. I couldn't tell them where I actually went during those long months away. I simply smiled, kept my head down, and endured the familiar sting of being the family disappointment. The breaking point arrived before the dessert plates were even brought out. Brad announced he was making a large donation to an exclusive private foundation, prompting my father to raise a toast to his only truly successful child. When I didn't immediately join the applause, my mother snapped. She stood up, slammed her linen napkin onto the table, and declared that my quiet presence was bringing down the holiday spirit. She told me plainly that Christmas was reserved for winners, not dead weight. My father grabbed my small duffel bag from the hallway and opened the front door, letting the freezing December air spill across the polished hardwood floors. Brad smirked into his wine glass. Without a single word of protest, I walked out into the falling snow, entirely forgetting my heavy wool trench coat hanging quietly on the brass coat rack in their foyer. I started my car and drove toward a nearby hotel, leaving their warm, arrogant house behind. The truth was far from the mundane narrative my family had constructed. I was not an underpaid paper pusher. I was Commander Evelyn Vance, lead tactical strategist for naval intelligence and director of the Pacific Fleet's autonomous supply chain grid. 4 years I operated under stringent Title 10 security protocols, forbidden from revealing the scope of my responsibilities, the missions I directed, or the hundreds of personnel whose movements hinged on my tactical assessments. My family's dismissive arrogance had always stung, but operational security came before personal pride. When Brad lectured me on naval contract mechanisms, he was talking about an obsolete framework. In reality, the cutting-edge maritime coordination software his entire corporate division was attempting to pitch to the Department of Defense was an initiative that sat squarely on my desk, awaiting my sole operational clearance. To them, I was a ghost in a drab sweater. To the Pentagon, I was the final gatekeeper on multi-billion-dollar strategic assets. Sitting on the edge of the queen-sized bed in a modest hotel room 3 miles from my parents' house, I reached down to check my coat pocket for my secure token. A cold shock ran through my veins. The heavy wool trench coat was still hanging on the coat rack next to my parents' front door. Tucked securely into its inner breast pocket was a high-grade encrypted command drive, a hardware key requiring biometric authorization that linked directly to Pacific Command's classified neural routing systems. Under standard standing orders, leaving that device unsecured was a critical breach of protocol. Before I could grab my car keys to retrieve it, the secondary secure satellite phone in my purse pulsed with a low rhythmic vibration. The screen flashed with an immediate code red priority banner. Task Force Sentinel Override. An emergent maritime contingency in the Western Corridor required an immediate emergency response session. Central Command was scrambling the regional liaison unit to extract me for immediate deployment. The military machine was already mobilizing, and they had my last known location registered directly at my parents' address. Back at my parents' house, the atmosphere was thick with self-congratulation. Chloe was laughing by the fireplace, cutting thick slices of cherry pie, while my mother poured vintage champagne. Brad lounged back on the leather sofa, regaling the table with stories about how trimming dead weight was the first rule of executive leadership. They toasted to their own refined company, thrilled to have purged the table of what they considered an embarrassing low-earning sister. Their celebration lasted exactly 3 hours. At 9:15 p.m., the quiet neighborhood street lit up with the sudden flash of low-profile emergency strobes. 2 armored black Suburbans rolled up the driveway, followed by an official Navy command vehicle. Heavy tires crunched over the fresh snow, effectively sealing off the entrance to the property. Through the front bay window my father froze, setting his champagne flute down with a tremor. Brad stood up, laughing nervously, assuming some high-level corporate associates had arranged an elaborate holiday greeting. The front doorbell did not chime. Instead, 3 sharp, thunderous knocks shook the oak frame. When my father opened the door, a pair of armed military police officers in combat gear flanked the entryway. Stepping past them into the foyer was 4-star Admiral Thomas Hayes, Deputy Commander of Naval Operations. His stern, weathered face was set like carved granite, his formal service uniform adorned with rows of ribbons that made Brad's expensive watch look like a child's toy. "Excuse me, sir," my father stammered, stepping back in complete shock. "There must be a mistake. This is a private residence." Brad immediately rushed forward, adjusting his tie and offering an obsequious smile. "Admiral, good evening. I'm Brad Miller, Director at Apex Defense Solutions. Are you here regarding our upcoming procurement proposal?" Admiral Hayes didn't spare him a glance. His sharp eyes scanned the foyer, instantly bypassing the luxury decorations and zeroing in on the brass coat rack. Hanging there was my tailored charcoal wool coat. On the lapel sat a discreet, subdued silver oak leaf pin, alongside an official Naval Intelligence Command patch stitched into the inner seam. Admiral Hayes reached out, his gloved fingers touching the collar. He turned back toward the room, his voice cutting through the silent house like a blade. "She was here." My mother swallowed hard, confused. "Who? Our daughter Evelyn? We sent her away hours ago." Hayes's expression hardened into absolute fury. "You sent her away? This coat belongs to Commander Vance. We have an operational emergency and we need my commander back at command immediately. Where is she?" The color drained from Brad's face until he looked like a corpse in an expensive suit. "Commander," he stammered, his confident posture collapsing entirely. "Sir, there's a misunderstanding. Evelyn is just a junior logistics employee. She doesn't hold military rank." Admiral Hayes stepped forward, towering over Brad with a stare of pure ice. "Junior employee? You are speaking about the chief architect of the Navy's next-generation autonomous grid. Her tactical clearance outranks half the Pentagon, and every defense proposal your little firm submits sits on her desk for review. If she turns down your bid, your entire company doesn't see a dime of government funding for the next decade. And you threw her out in the snow?" A sickening silence fell over the room. Chloe let out a sharp gasp, dropping her dessert plate to the hardwood floor with a loud crash. My mother began to tremble violently, clutching the mantel for support, while my father stood frozen in utter humiliation. "Call her," Admiral Hayes ordered, his voice brooking no argument. "Now." My mother fumbled with her phone, her fingers shaking so badly she dropped it twice before managing to dial my number on speaker. I answered on the second ring. "Evelyn." "Honey," she sobbed, her voice breaking with frantic desperation. "Please, sweetheart, you have to come back. There's an admiral here, and armed guards. They're saying you're a commander. Please, Evelyn, we're so sorry, we didn't know." "Put the admiral on the line, mother," I replied calmly. Hayes took the phone. "Commander Vance. We have a Tier 1 situational override in the Pacific. We tracked your secure token to this address." "Understood, Admiral. I'm 3 minutes out in a hotel shuttle." 2 minutes later, an official transport escorted me up the snowy driveway. The front door was wide open. As I stepped through the entryway wearing my simple clothes, the 2 armed security officers snapped to attention, their boots clicking against the hardwood in perfect synchronization. Admiral Hayes offered a crisp, formal salute. "Good to see you, Commander." I returned the salute smoothly. In the living room, my entire family stood paralyzed in shock, watching in absolute terror as the sister and daughter they had mocked as a worthless failure was treated as the most powerful person in the room. I walked past my frozen family and retrieved my charcoal trench coat from the brass rack. Unzipping the hidden interior pocket, I withdrew the encrypted command drive and handed it to Admiral Hayes. He gave a sharp nod, securing it in his tactical case. My father took a tentative step toward me, his hands trembling. "Evelyn, sweetheart. We didn't understand. Why didn't you just tell us who you were? We would have treated you so differently." I looked at him, then at my mother, whose eyes were wide with desperate regret, and finally at Brad, who was visibly sweating through his tailored shirt. "That's the point, Dad," I said quietly, my voice steady and completely devoid of anger. "Respect shouldn't depend on a title, a uniform, or how much money someone makes. You should have treated me with decency simply because I was your daughter." Brad cleared his throat, stepping forward with a pleading look. "Evelyn, Commander Vance. About our firm's proposal. I hope you know my earlier comments were just friendly holiday banter. Your proposal has already been flagged for a complete ethical review, Brad," I replied coldly. "Integrity is a fundamental requirement for defense partners. You showed none tonight." He looked as though he had been struck, knowing his career at Apex Defense Solutions was effectively finished. I slipped my trench coat on, buttoning it against the winter chill. My mother reached out to touch my arm, but I stepped back, severing 28 years of begging for conditional love in one quiet movement. There were no tears, no yelling, and no dramatic scenes. Just the cold, undeniable weight of consequences. "I'm ready, Admiral," I said, turning my back on the family that had cast me aside. "Lead the way, Commander," Admiral Hayes replied. The military police escorted me out the front door, leaving my family standing alone in the ruined silence of their opulent house. As the command vehicle pulled out into the snow, heading toward the airbase, I felt lighter than I ever had before. I didn't need their validation anymore. I had earned my place in the world, and I was moving forward into a future built on honor, purpose, and real respect.